For over 200 years, the Vikings were the terror of Europe. They raided everywhere from Russia to Ireland and even set foot on the North American continent. But why did these fierce Northmen suddenly appear? The answer is surprising. It doesn't lie in the Vikings' frozen homeland, but thousands of miles away in the deserts of Arabia. Events here would trigger a movement that would cause the previously isolated Vikings to explode onto the world stage. This is Knowledge Voyage. World history is like squeezing a balloon. What happens at one end has an impact on the other end. The frosted forests of Scandinavia and the Arabian Desert are certainly opposite ends of a balloon, but what happened in one would have massive consequences in the other. The first cause, the Viking Age, occurred not in the Arctic Circle, but nearly 4,000 miles away in the deserts of Arabia. From these deserts came a new conquering faith that would totally break ancient patterns of trade. That faith was Islam, and its Arab warriors would rapidly spread the faith across the Mediterranean world. Prior to the rise of Islam, Europe's trade had been centered around the Mediterranean, and had been since the time of the Greeks and the Romans. But as Arab raiders fired by Islam conquered across North Africa, trade patterns were broken, and the trade centered on the Mediterranean world was gone. This caused economic and trade activity to move farther away from the Mediterranean, and move instead towards Charlemagne's lands in the north coast of Europe around the North and Baltic seas. The Vikings, whose lands bordered these northern seas, became aware of the sudden explosion of wealthy ports and expensive goods on their doorstep, which had previously been poor and unimpressive. Had it not been for the rise of Islam and the displacement of international trade in a more sharply northern direction, the Vikings would never have become aware of the wealth of their neighbours. Prior to international trade being pushed under Viking eyes, they didn't realise the riches that could be had. But thanks to the shift in patterns, they now knew and compared the vast trade ships with gold, silver, silk and jewels with their own society's poverty. So why were the Vikings so ready to fight to close this gap? The answer lies in the high Viking birth rate. Unlike most of Europe, which was Christian and monogamous, Viking lands were pagan. Viking pagans practiced polygamy and often subsidized this with concubines, mistresses, underwives and sex slaves. Added to this was the Vikings being a masculine battle culture that praised virility and siring large families. The result was a vastly growing birth rate. Unlike their monogamous Christian opponents who could only have one child at a time, a Viking warrior could sire many children with multiple partners in the same time. So how does a high birth rate drive violence? The answer is Welton Clark's demographic theory of war. According to this theory, cultures with large families are less afraid of war than cultures with small ones. This is because a war that killed 2 children would wipe out a family of 2, but have less of an effect on a family of 10. This means that cultures with high birth rates tend to be more willing to risk death in war because they can sustain high casualties in war to get resources and land. Many Dark Age accounts of Vikings by other Europeans made note of the large size of their armies and families, which seems to confirm this theory. Another factor that explains the rise of the Viking Age was the harshness of their homelands of what is now Norway, Sweden and Denmark. Historians have noticed that many raiding and conquering battle cultures have arisen in very harsh environments. When a culture arises in a harsh environment, it has 2 effects. In the first instance, the harshness is so unpleasant, it fills the people of that culture with an urge to leave that environment by striking violently into less harsh neighbouring lands. Ibn Khaldun added that a harsh environment makes its people also feel a strong sense of loyalty and commitment to each other, another way that makes them better warriors. This pattern held for several of the great raiding peoples of history. For the Arabs, it was the burning heat and poverty of their desert homeland that saw them strike out at Persia and the Byzantines. For the Mongols, it was the desolate steppes that saw them attack the wealthy lands of China. And for the Vikings, it was the unbearable cold and jagged mountains that drove them to raid European seas. The second feature of developing in a harsh environment is it creates physically and psychologically tough people. Arabs were used to going long periods without water and didn't eat for a month or so at a time in Ramadan. Mongol riders would eat raw meat and spend days at a time in the hard saddles of their horses. Vikings were every bit as tough as any other people born and bred in a harsh environment. Scandinavia is one of the hardest places for humans to live. It has jagged mountains and travelling between valleys was dangerous due to steep inclines, poor paths and the risk of avalanches. Very little land is suitable for crops, and even minor weather changes could wreck crops. The tall forests were hard to navigate and were perfect hiding grounds for wolves that preyed on livestock and children. Fishing expeditions on cold seas with high winds and waves could be deadly. In short, Vikings lived in poverty, cold, and the risk of death was something they faced regularly, and this makes for tough people. So why did the Vikings attack some countries and not others? The answer lies in the relative strength of their neighbours. Charlemagne had made the Holy Roman Empire lands of France and Germany too strong to attack. The Vikings did not want to attack the strength of the Holy Roman Empire, so they picked weaker and more exposed opponents. England was an island with navigable rivers and, unlike the lands of Charlemagne, did not have a powerful protector. It was also divided into squabbling Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and as a result, England saw escalating Viking raids, culminating in outright invasion and colonisation for most of the Viking era. Whilst Norwegian and Danish Vikings struck west away from Charlemagne's lands, Swedish Vikings struck east away from Charlemagne's lands and into the Slav tribes. The tribes there noticed the Vikings' rowing boats, and the word for rower or oarsman in one language is Russ. This would ultimately influence the word Russia. So, in short, several factors drove why the Viking Age began. Firstly, the way international trade and wealth was pushed northwards by the Arab conquest of the Dark Ages in the southern Mediterranean. Once these trade patterns were placed directly under Viking noses in the North and Baltic Seas, the fact they were aware of their relative deprivation and poverty spurred them to act. Their harsh homeland made them natural warriors, and their high birth rate made them more willing to risk sons in war against more cautious neighbours. Finally, the strength of Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire diverted Viking attacks away from attacking the stronger parts of Europe, and instead to raid and attack the weaker lands at either side of his, like England or the Slav tribes. So that's how a combination of psychological theories and international relations theories explain how one of the world's most fascinating cultures exploded onto the world stage. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you.